Yeah, this is basically a short summary of the review of tenure and governance in pastoral lands in East and West Africa that we did. It was myself who will present, together with Lance Robinson, a colleague who used to work for ILRI, and Mary Ellen, who's on the call here. Myself and Lance, we focus more on East Africa, and Mary Ellen on West Africa. Yeah, so it's a joint effort. And yeah, I'd also like to thank the many people who contributed by reviewing the paper in its various forms. So the review was, it was basically a desk-based review, focusing on secondary data, journal articles, reports, and also policy and legislation. So a couple of, what were they, Mary? Not interns, but assistants at ODI helped collate the policy and legislation that we could access. And we were trying to kind of do that a little in a quantifiable way, like ticking boxes whether pastoralists were mentioned in the Constitution and pastoral rights were mentioned in the Constitution, etc. So we did that side of things as well. But it does need verification. We didn't actually publish that part because I think we need to go back to it and check a few things. We weren't entirely sure that everything was correct as it could be there. We didn't actually interview people, but we did get in touch with people to ask for advice about reports or documents, and bounce out of ideas of them. And as I said, we had quite a large group of people reviewing the documents. So there was a lot of suggestions and back and forth as part of that. East Africa is more comprehensive than West Africa, with both Lance and me focusing more on the East Africa. Mary had a bigger job, and I also think the information is much more dispersed in West Africa, and we didn't. Of course, this was a review, and we started digging deeper into particular countries or trying to cover all countries, but it was just becoming too much. So we kind of stepped back a bit then and tried to look at kind of what were the main trends and issues that were happening without digging too deep into specific countries. We were quite under pressure with the document, but as the team knows, I pushed back quite a lot the deadlines that we were given, because we wanted to give it some time for reflection and analysis, because there were trends happening and it just needed some time thinking, so what do these trends actually mean, and trying to dig out the more interesting trends and coming up with some kind of thoughts based on our own experience. What could this mean, or what direction are we going in, and what does this mean for policy and legislation? So I think in the end we did, it wasn't just a review, but we have kind of put a few ideas out there that are kind of the starting point for a debate around some of these issues about pastoral land tenure and governance and how best it can be secured. And these need to continue to be discussed and kind of dug deeper, or to look at some country case studies to explore those issues more deeply, I think. So the key areas covered, we kind of brought together current theoretical thinking and discussions on pastoral land tenure and governance. And I mean, tried not to go into that too deeply because some of it is very academic, but we tried to kind of bring in the main kind of things that are being discussed at the moment. We started highlighting the importance of linchpin resources. So these are basically the resources that pastoralists cannot do without to ensure that the whole pastoral system functions adequately. So I'm talking about dry season grazing lands with a permanent water point. So pastoralists are very good about using the rest of the land for most of the year, but at key points, when there is no water available on the surface in the majority areas, they need access to those linchpin resources, permanent, that have permanent water that they can access in the dry season. And of course, these are the areas that are much more easily irrigated and often more fertile because they're getting silt off the rivers when the rivers flood, etc. So these are kind of what we started in the paper really kind of flagging as linchpin resources. And you'll see by the end of the paper, we were kind of saying, well, because of the complexity of pastoral land tenure and the slowness of finding a solution to secure the whole pastoral area, because it is so complicated, maybe what we do need to do is shift our attention to securing these linchpin resources before they disappear, because the pastoral systems cannot survive without them. So you'll see that kind of growing through the document if you've had a chance to look at it. We also focused on trying to get some idea of the status of formalization of land tenure security. I mean, what is going on, but actually it was very difficult. It was quite easy to see what policy and legislation it was, but when it actually comes to implementation, there are a lot of problems, a lot of gaps, and it's actually very difficult to find good practice of formalization processes in countries. We didn't tackle conflict and land. We didn't tackle conflict and land because I started to, and then we just realized it's such a big topic in itself, and to really do it justice, it needs a separate paper. And particularly for SPARC, it's obviously a very key linkage, key issue, and needs exploring in itself. One area that we did identify, so this is one of the interesting trends that we saw, was in the absence of the ongoing land tenure security that pastoralists face, pastoralists aren't just sitting back and letting their land disappear, but they are taking different actions, tactics, strategies to secure land and resources. And this kind of ranges from privatization, so where possible, they will secure private areas of land at the same time as accessing communal areas. They will pay fees for accessing land. There's also, as land becomes more fragmented and privatized, on the other side, there is a movement, or in parallel, there's a movement to kind of recreating the commons. So like in southern Kenya, where rangelands have been divided for a couple of decades or a few decades now, there are kind of land, pastoral land associations that are bringing private landholders together and trying to kind of have agreements across private land holdings to allow that movement and kind of recreating the commons in many ways. There was an interesting trend about some pastoralists, particularly in central Kenya, of using private property as an anchor for accessing a wider landscape. So we saw this in Laikipia, which is basically pastoralists purchase a piece of land in the Laikipia landscape, like close to the town, and that gives them a legitimate place, a legitimacy as a resident to that area to access the common resources around it. Other trends, strategies, I've called it, well, we've called it playing the conservation card, but really, strategically thinking that if we make an alliance with these conservation organizations and implement conservation activities on our land, that will help us to secure the resources, and that partnership will help us to keep out other potential threats to our land. The same with like women securing rights. Often programs target women and private land as part of land securing programs in pastoral areas. And though that can lead to fragmentation of the pastoral landscape, it does mean that at least women in the household have a different type of security to that land. And then there's forum shopping, which I don't think needs the explanation. But so there's all these kind of different strategies, actions, and tactics that pastoralists are using at the moment. And this is kind of what we took from the literature. And it's certainly an area that we would like to explore a bit more and look at kind of the kind of knock-on impact of these. And we're talking about developing a framework to be able to analyze this in a more methodological way. That was basically kind of the main areas that we covered, and the discussion and the conclusions that came out of that. So these were kind of trying to think beyond the literature that we reviewed. So what does this mean, and what are some of the interesting points for discussion and further research going forward? It's still clear that the formalization of pastoral land tenure security is still very low. As I said, it's still very difficult to find good examples of either policy and legislation being put into practice, and even more so finding good examples of that. But despite this, actually, some studies that have been done, there are not very many asking pastoralists whether they feel secure. But actually, when you do go and ask pastoralists whether they feel secure about their land, often they will say that they do feel secure. And it's partly because of history, or partly because they haven't been disturbed from using that land, and in the absence of knowing, external forces that might make them vulnerable, they don't have that knowledge. One thing that for sure is happening, pastoral tenure systems are becoming more complex. So when I say pastoral tenure systems, I'm talking about how the pastoralists themselves access and govern their land. So on the previous slide, I was saying, pastoralists are using these different strategies to access land and resources. So all of this is making it more complicated. The pastoral tenure system is complicated anyway in its most simple form, because it has these different layers of use and secondary users, primary users, occasional users, movement across the landscape. But with all these new trends and trying to access land in different ways, it's becoming more complicated. And so trying to get to that point of developing a land tenure system that encompasses all of this complexity for the pastoral landscape really is becoming more and more difficult. And it's not surprising that governments are not providing a framework for securing communal tenure in pastoral systems, because it is so complicated. And the issues of the groups, who has the rights, who has the right to make decisions as well. It's very complicated. Which then brings us to that point about, well, in the absence of tenure security, we do know that these linchpin resources are disappearing very quickly. So should we turn our focus then away from trying to push for tenure security of the whole pastoral landscape and move towards a focus on trying to secure those linchpin resources for pastoralists, which are less complicated and easier for us to, or easier for governments, etc., to identify who has the rights to those, and then to leave the wider landscape in a less formalized mode of tenure insecurity, because pastoralists can then find their way around that to secure kind of or to access the resources that are kind of secondary but more in quantity. And then I mean, another thing to put out there is that what seems to be a trend that's coming up, or a solution, is to rather than focus on giving pastoralists one single land holding certificate that encompasses everything, and that is the piece of paper that they hold, but it is the only piece of paper that they hold. Rather than this, is it better to focus on trying to find ways to add what could be weaker layers of tenure security, but layer them so that altogether as a package, they're stronger than one tidy land holding certificate. So I'm talking about, okay, so for a dry season grazing area, it could be present in a village land use plan. So that's one level of tenure security. On top of that, you could have a communal land holding certificate for that. So that's a second layer. On top of that, that grazing land could be registered in the Ministry of Livestock's register of grazing lands. And then on top of that, you could have a conservation organization that's in partnership with those pastoralists to bringing conservation aspects to the land. So, that's 4 layers of tenure security rather than one tidy land holding certificate. And that example that I've given is something that is happening in Tanzania, for example. Then there's the whole issue of pastoral women and land rights, and that discussion about whether women are better off securing their land and rights through the group, or being given individual certificates kind of outside the group. And we would argue that in the long term, women are better off in securing their rights through the collective, as long as the collective group is strong and has rights to themselves, has strong rights themselves. And then, recognizing that pastoralists are strategizing and mobilizing, engaging, innovating. Building the capacity of pastoralists to do this themselves may be a better way of investing resources in securing land, rather than trying to work on a complex land holding certificate. So then they've got the capacity themselves to work out how best they can secure land. And finally, I mean, these were some of the more interesting ideas and thoughts I think that came out of it, but out of the review, but it does require a different way of thinking and doing. And we haven't really shared these kind of thoughts very in places for discussions yet, but I think it is definitely something that we can do going forward. And I'm not sure that these are solutions, but I think they're really, some of them are really interesting things to have future discussions on. Oh, and sorry. Oh, and then gaps. So these were some of the gaps that we identified. Focusing on one thing that I think as pastoralist livelihoods progressed, not progressed, but changed, diversify, etc. We shouldn't be assuming that pastoralists, there are different reasons why pastoralists want land now than in the past. And this is something I think would be an interesting research question, is to understand that a bit more. The most appropriate approach I kind of talked about, learning more about those strategic actions, activities that I mentioned, Pastoral Women, Land Tenure and Governance, the costs and benefits of land use change. So recognizing, really trying to properly value what is the loss of those linchpin resources on the wider landscape. I mean, this really isn't taken into account in the cost benefit analysis that's taken place at the moment. Outcomes and impact assessments. I mean, as I said, it's really difficult to find good evidence and good practice of land tenure interventions. Relationship between land tenure and conflict, I've said it really is a gap we have. It's something that we haven't explored yet. And yeah, relationship between climate change, land access, tenure and governance. I mean, with this, I think there's probably not a very strong direct linkage, but I think there's implications of climate change and how it's addressed that will have an impact on land access, tenure and governance. So that's also something I think to explore. So that's that. Oh gosh, I keep thinking. Yeah, so that's just our priorities that we're trying to, if we have to choose anything to work on over the next couple of months, these are the things. There were several journal articles that could come out of this, and we've committed to at least to produce at least one. We haven't really shared this with FCDO or we haven't had a discussion with the land team at FCDO, so I think that will be something useful to do. I'd like to get there to hear their thoughts on it. So that really is the last slide.
We're all waiting for the next one. Thanks, Fiona. That's great. As I mentioned before, I think what we'll do is if you've got a question, please jot it down. We'll pivot to Rupcha now, and then we can come back for a broader discussion. But that's great. And just I mean, I think one thing we can do as an immediate follow-up would be to share the landscape paper, just to remind everybody that it's there. But I think that at least two of those follow-ups, Fiona, we've already started to discuss as next steps. So that's terrific. And just for everybody's benefit, I mean, we're doing these scoping studies, kind of a vast topic, but really trying to narrow down to some specific research threads where there's clear gaps in the literature that SPARC can help fill. And so it's a very useful exercise to do this kind of work. So Rupcha, I'll hand it over to you. Just as an FYI, I don't know, Fiona, if you saw, I give a 2-minute warning. I'll just plop a 2-minute warning into the chat box, but I just want to make sure, Rupcha, that you're able to see that while you're presenting.
I am not sure that once you share screen whether I'll be able to do it, but I have my own stopwatch, so I'll be mindful.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you see it on full screen mode?
Not yet.
Right now we see your
Teams meeting thingy, I think. Oh, okay. That's weird. Yeah, that is a bit weird. Okay, let me stop sharing and start again. Yeah.
Sure.
I have no idea what. Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good.
It's there. Yeah.
And I don't know why the Teams thing keeps coming up, but okay. Okay, so I'm not sure why this is happening, but you can also see the notes, I think, but it's fine. We'll just go with it. Otherwise, we'll just end up wasting time, I think.
Actually,
Yeah, so,
we can't see the notes. It's the full presentation. So it's
okay,
perfect.
great,
Yeah,
excellent.
yeah.
Okay, then that's good. Then. Okay, so thanks everyone, and hello to all. So I'll be presenting on the on the state of finance, as we call it, or the financing livestock trade. And this is and this is just not by me. I'm just the one presenting it. And as you can see, it's a big study group, and it was a combination of us who kind of designed the study, and of course also the people who helped us collect some of the data. So basically, the motivation of the study is that I think everybody over here knows that that Africa drylands comprise of herders producing livestock and extensive systems, and are nomadic and transhumans. However, we know that the sources of income also include selling of livestock and livestock products. What we have seen in the recent past is that there's a demand of red meat and is making growth into the livestock business, as in so it's being promoted more as a business venture, and as a result of which there is also requirement of capital. The purpose of this study, therefore, is to look into the degrees to which people actually access formal financial services, and to what extent is it actually used in the different actors in the livestock value chain. We also try to explore the development of the formal financial services in the drylands over a period of time, not really a dryland, but not really a timeline, but more or less in terms of trying to understand through literature. But with the full awareness that this process is challenging by the herders, it requires high transaction costs from the financial institution, and of course there is always a big issue of inclusion into the formal system. Therefore, the objective of this study is basically to understand the means of financing livestock markets. And one of the reasons why we chose Mali, Kenya, and Somalia is because Kenya and Somalia is one place where a lot of work is already done, and Mali also to a large extent because it was one of the places where as ILRI, we had done some recent work, and we just thought that since we already have something ongoing, it would just be better to include these three countries, and also for the purposes of variety and also comparison between West Africa and East Africa. And so we also try to see the sources of capital and the extent to which formal financial services are used, like I said, and then also the implications for understanding of formal financial finance for livestock marketing and research and policy. As in, by this, what we mean is that do we actually does formal financing become the solution to the gap that is there when it comes to access to finance? The study period for this was between September to November 2021. So the methodology that we used, largely it was an existing, was a literature review of existing documents related to the three countries on the formal financial services, livestock production, and marketing. However, we just thought that instead of just relying on literature and kind of just saying what is already there, we decided to go for some phone-based and web-based interviews with livestock traders, business owners related to livestock, some of the project staff and international scholars and development programs. Most of the international scholars and the development programs were based were Mali based, because we realized there are a lot of initiatives which have come up in the recent past which are looking at financial inclusion. So the total respondents that we interviewed were about 30 businessmen and traders, and there were about 17 key informant interviews across the three countries. When we talk about the key informants, essentially it goes back to the international scholars, the development programs, and also some of the local county level officials in the case of Somalia as well as in Kenya. Then the data analysis was mainly qualitative with very low level coding, just so that we could get some themes going around which could be standardized or which could be cutting across all the three countries. So the key findings, so the first part of the key findings is essentially the general findings for all the three countries. So basically what we realized from the state of finance is that they're mostly informal financial services in the rural areas. The sources of capital are from savings, loans, and gifts within families, close friends, and trusted businessmen. So when we're talking about loans, this loan also includes taking loans on a transactional basis between friends and families. The need or use of formal credit mechanisms, it's kind of like some of them use the formal credit mechanisms, but it is only after a certain stage, as in on an average, if you, all the people that we spoke to, they're usually the startup capital, even if they are an established business, be it in the terms of livestock trade or any business related to livestock production, that initial startup capital has always been from their friends and relatives or even from remittances. It's only after they reach a certain stage that they actually look for banks, because purely because if they want to expand their business, that is the kind of capital which probably the banks will be able to provide them, but friends and relatives won't be able to. And also it's also about not relying too much on them when it comes to their business expansion. In terms of the roles of banks and microfinance, there are two ways to this. Number one, there are very few banks who are actually willing to invest in risky portfolios for such as livestock. So you might actually see certain banks investing in crop loans and things like that, but that very same bank will probably not want to do it for livestock because of reasons like saying that they're affected by drought, people migrate, so on and so forth. And then some MFIs are functional, but not to the scale that we would expect. The second part of it is that even the people themselves, they do not like operating with banks because of tons of paperwork that is associated with it, need for a collateral, whatever have you, and also they do not generally trust them, and also they're not branches enough that they can actually go there and operate in banks. They probably have to either travel to another city or they have to travel really far, and honestly the transaction cost is just not worth it. In terms of use of mobile money, the payments usually, the mobile money is basically used for selling and for transactions of giving and sending money, but there's not so much use of mobile banking as such. So you will see people using M-Pesa or Orange Money, but you will not really see them using like NCBA features of like savings credit and whatnot, or those kind of things. So this is like a quick snapshot of the three countries. There is not really much of a similarity or difference that we would say in the countries, but it's just to give like an idea about like the state of the three countries where certain areas are concerned. What we have seen is that in Kenya is probably the only country which has the most developed financial sector in the Horn or in the East African region, to the extent that that about 83% of the urban population in some way or the other is related to a formal financial mechanism. However, the access to financial services continues to be poor in the drylands. But in the case of Somalia, banking services only reach 16% of the population, mostly of whom are urban. The remaining of them actually rely very heavily on remittances, hawala, and informal financing. In Mali, it is less than 13% of the adult population who even have a bank account, and there is heavy reliance on informal sources. Then the other thing is that there is very less availability of pro-poor products, and also in the case of Mali, though at some point in time the MFIs were doing really well, and they almost made up about 12% of financial services, the coup in 2012, along with an overextended lending portfolio, kind of almost led to the collapse of MFIs, but it is again now growing. Like I mentioned earlier, basically digital money is basically used for sending and receiving money. An interesting thing is that Islamic banking is actually gaining ground both in Kenya as well as Somalia. In Kenya, it was first introduced by Barclays, and in Somalia, it's actually a collaboration between the Habshil and the Islamic ISD, Islamic Development Financing, I think. Sorry about the acronym. In Mali, on Mali, on the other hand, like I said, that there are several initiatives that have come up, like such as Farm and Inclusive, which are bringing together organizations such as IFAD, then the government, and also some international development NGOs who are actually looking into projects which will actually bring together some sense of financial inclusion, or at least trying to get in like every aspect of people into the financial process, be it pastoral or even the non-pastoral areas. In terms of how did access to finance was affected by COVID, one of the reasons why I'm mentioning this is that though in the other two countries, there was not much significant mention of COVID-19 on the axis of finance. In Somalia, it was mentioned for the simple reason that there is a very heavy reliance on remittances, and everybody across the board actually felt that pinch because of the pandemic, because it just significantly dropped. So in some sense, a lot of this actually affected their business and their way of functioning, because it was kind of like one source of finance was in some sense cut off for a very long period of time because of the pandemic movement, and also people suffering across the board. The remittances just stopped coming after a point in time. So when we come to the discussion bit, I think it's not so much the way that we wanted to do this is that not so much give answers or give our opinion, but rather in terms of ask questions, which can be something not only a food for thought, but maybe areas of further research going forward. First of all, through our study, one question that we actually asked is that, is there really need for more capital in the marketing chains? Because the reason that why we are asking is that there really, or at least there seems to be no dearth of capital or money moving around in some sense, because if that was not the case, how has livestock trade and meat supply actually continued so far? Because that requires capital, transport, and so on and so forth. So the question that we are asking, is it the need for more capital, or is it the need for recognition of the way that the system operates around financial access and financial availability or capital availability? Number two is that, of course, in Kenya and also in places like Somalia and now in Mali, there are talks of introducing livestock insurance. In Kenya, it has already been there. So the question that we are asking is that how can insurance services be used to further manage risk and development markets? And by this, what we mean is that the question that we are asking is that the range of insurance products that are currently available, given the changing times and so many dynamics and variables coming into the picture, are the other ones currently available serving the purpose of market inclusion and building resilience, or is it something that we need to think about a little bit more in terms of probably bundling of other services like information savings credit, and think about like what is the best way of doing it? The third one that we're talking about is working capital the answer, or is it public investments, or both? So essentially what we mean is that should local governments be more involved when it comes to decisions around intervention and financial services and market functioning, because sometimes or most of the time what it happens is that there are interventions by international organizations, so on and so forth, and the local governments are usually just informed after everything is designed and all that. It becomes more of like an afterthought. So probably if the capacity of these local governments are actually built more, it might be that there could be a space more for public investments, and then like the working capital can become like a top-up kind of thing. So therefore, finally, when we're talking about the priorities and the risks in developing rural financing, one of the things that we need to acknowledge and also think about is that, number one, shocks and risks of potential shocks are several and severe, resulting in volatility in markets. So therefore, given that this is there and to a large extent will continue to remain, what are the steps that we should take to ensure that there are still enough investments and still the market is growing in these areas? And then, of course, there is a potential utility of insurance for local and central governments. Though the issue that we always struggle with, and we still continue to do it, that there is a challenge when it comes to uptake. So what are the steps that we need to take to ensure that like the uptake of insurance is there, and essentially how does it become more of a value for money proposition for the clients or for the beneficiaries or for the pastoralist who's actually getting into this scheme? The third one is the development of rural financial services may be better served not so much by a unitary or idealized model, but by creating an ecosystem of finance. But by this, what do we mean essentially is that there should be in some sense a recognition that there are different kinds of financial models and financial modalities that are there. How do we kind of reconcile, number one, all of this, and then how do we ensure that they're kind of working together and recognizing each other? Like, for example, like if you're talking about something like credit scoring, there is usually like a very standardized method of credit scoring, and one of them is that how much a formal financial transaction has person A and person B done. But given that most of this ecosystem actually relies on informal finance, how can we innovative and make sure that that can also be included to show that this person actually has a good record of borrowing, returning, as well as using the capital that he is giving. The final one, what we to think about is that if the progress lies in basically doing some radical changes, such as probably like formalizing everything that is there, like markets or whatever it is, and methods of finance, or is it that do we actually pinpoint some small areas and we actually work on those improvements, which then can have a cascading or like a spillover overall effect on the way finance is accessed and where the markets function. Finally, on the limitations of study, this was a rapid assessment, so therefore a lot of these insights cannot, well, I wouldn't say cannot be generalized, but of course really further investigation needs, and the sampling was also done based on the purposiveness and the opportunity that we got to talk to people. In the case of this study, all traders were men, except for the chairwoman of the Camel Marketing as a cooperative in Kenya, and also some literature that we got in for Somalia in terms of how women use finance and what are the areas of finance and what does accessibility mean to them. So therefore it would be good actually to focus a little bit more on that aspect and actually see how financial access differs between men and women, and also in terms of also intra-gender. Yeah, so with that, thank you.
It's great. Thank you, Rupsha. Two really good presentations. Very different, actually, in the kind of work that was being presented, but great. I'm mindful of time, so why don't we go directly to questions? If anybody's got any questions for either Fiona or Rupsha, you can take those. So perhaps you could just put your hand up in the box, and I'll go through as they appear.
I think Sarah has her hand up.
Oh, okay. Ahead, oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't see it. Top corner. Go, Sarah, please.
Hi, Fiona and Rupsha. Unfortunately, I've got to jet to another meeting too, but I'd just like to pose it and then maybe catch in the recording. This is perhaps a tricky question. It's something that came up in the longitudinal study. I was wondering if you had a sense of how we could start tackling sort of in the research mix within SPARC, the tricky question of the role of armed groups in playing a role in lending and financing, and then also in mediating land tenure water resource disputes. We were seeing in the longitudinal research, for instance, in Somalia, Al-Shabaab was mentioned as a key mediating force in our sites in Middle and Lower Shabelle. And also in Nigeria, they're definitely playing a role in some of the conflict and the cattle raids and that sort of thing. And then also in terms of the second question, two-parter, when mentioning local governments and how to involve them in building some of these financing options, one of the things that at least came out again in both sites in Nigeria and in Somalia, it was a distrust of the local area governments. So I'd be curious of how you would see your recommendations of working around this, of how do you balance trying to engage with local governments when perhaps trust levels are not so high?
Two great questions. Perhaps I could suggest Chloe ask her question, and then we'll just take them together, and then we'll go to, we'll let you respond, and then we'll go to Daniel afterwards. Chloe, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you guys both for the presentations. It's interesting always to hear the work presented this way as well as the report. I had a couple of questions for Fiona actually on the land piece. One is a smaller one, I think related to Fiona, your comment about what are the reasons that pastors are securing land. But I was wondering if you came across in the literature as well looking at identities and who's considered a pastoralist and for what reason they're securing land, and whether or not we're seeing where land use is changing. Is it because the land is staying within the hands of quote unquote cultural pastoralists, but then changing the land use, or is land use changing because there's less herding going on, and so pastoralists more as a production system? So I'm curious about that one. And then second, as related to innovation in land, I was scanning some of the literature in this area, and it's heavily focused on technology and especially land administration and how can technology be used, satellite imagery, various blockchain, et cetera, on securing land through administrative rights. But I was trying to think through if we flip that towards the problems and like what are the key problems that pastoralists are facing now. If it is, for example, like the paper is drawing this insight, if it's around how do we secure these anchor resources, what sort of innovations are called on, or what sort of innovations do we need in order to be able to do that better? So if you think about, so the question being, if we think about land innovation as what are the key problems that require innovation to solve them, I'm curious what would come up from the review.
Great. So I count 4 questions, the latter 2 for you, Fiona, and then the other 2 on conflict and distrust of local government. Who would like to start?
I think Fiona can go first.
Okay, go Fiona.
Okay, thanks, Rupsha. Okay, so starting with Sarah's ones. I don't know. I mean, the review we did was a starting point. So I'm not sure what plans there are to do more detailed, I think this would involve very much a case study, zooming in on that particular issue. I mean, of course, we haven't, as I said, we didn't touch conflict and land within this paper. So, I mean, this kind of example could be brought into the paper on land and conflict. So from that perspective, we could explore it a little, but yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how we, I mean, I guess this is a question for SPARC overall, you know, if interesting issues are coming up that we want to flag, and so that, say, for example, in a future study in Somalia, this is an issue that's one of a list of things that we could include, you know, where do we put that, apart from putting it in the chat here? You know, it would be good to, I guess, have some consolidated list of small gaps or ideas that are coming up, to put it there. I mean, I think the second part of that question is related to that. So, yeah. I'll leave you to finish that one off, Rupsha. Okay. I'll go to close ones, which was slightly easier to answer, I think. No, I mean, we didn't really look at identity very strongly and culture, but it was also something that Jeremy Lin flagged when he reviewed the paper, and it's something that, yes, could have an impact on things, or a different influence on outcomes of things, but it's not something that we specifically looked at because we didn't really look at the local level. We were relying on literature that was available, and this wasn't an issue that was tackled. But yeah, no, I think it's probably something that comes within the strategies, which also relates to your second question about innovations. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, you know, innovations to me about securing land is that whole chapter, that whole section of the report on the strategies, tactics, and actions that pastoralists are taking. I mean, those for me are innovations from the pastoralist point of view, and none of those are technologies. They're all broader sense type innovations in terms of processes and actions. So for me, that would be a starting point for looking at less technological innovations.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Over to you, Rupsha.
Thanks for those questions. Okay, on the first part about conflict and finance, well, honestly, at this moment, I don't have an answer, but what I can say is that this is an area probably which should be looked at very keenly, because at the moment, what we are trying to explore is the relationship of financial services such as insurance with conflict in terms of mitigating it, or in post-conflict areas, whether it can maintain the peace in some sense. But this is definitely a very important topic to look at a larger financial strategy, that how do you deal with, and it's a very valid point, because it's just not in Somalia, but even in places in northern Kenya, such as Wajir, Garissa, and all that, we for a fact know that generally the community has affiliations with Al-Shabaab, like in some way or the other, and because and this is a purely anecdotal evidence, and we will not name people, but that is, it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship which exists. But so how do you actually tackle this, and do you and how do you actually address this question? And I think it's a whole new discussion area, or a whole new study area, to actually see the role of finance in either increasing conflicts or even minimizing them, or the role of or the other way around also, in terms of the conflicts actually influencing the access to finance. So I think this is an area which we will have to look into sooner than later. So I wouldn't claim to have an answer to it right now. In terms of the trust of the local governments, I think, at least, okay, giving a case in Somalia, we need to start somewhere. And one of the ways to start this is basically to work with, say, established, well-reputed, both local as well as international organizations who are already kind of in some way or the other collaborating with government on interventions that are already there. Like a case in point is that we are now trying to launch it, like in the livestock insurance in Somalia. And one of the strategies that we have used is that we've partnered with a local organization called Somrep over there, who already have ties to the government. And we are basically working with them and the government, so that, and co-designing a kind of like an accountability model, or like a way that which they can interact with the community. And by virtue of the fact that this particular entity is there and they're trusted in the community, this like has kind of a spillover effect to have some kind of trust on the local government that is actually working in that area. So that could be like a starting point. And then, of course, there needs to be a lot of checks and balances, and just not the case of Somalia, also in places like Kenya or any other areas that we go to. But of course, there is always like a difference in terms of the levels at which these checks and balances need to be done. Yeah. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Rupsha. I've got a couple of points that I can, in closing, to address what you were saying, Fiona, about possible next steps. Just a couple of thoughts there, but let's go to Daniel. Daniel, perhaps for the last question. I don't see any other hands up. Go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for the two presenters. I think the emerging issues from this study are very, very insightful. And very quickly, I just want to flash out, I don't know if there are questions or comments, that's going to both presenters, both Fiona and Rupsha. And I'll be a little bit biased because I'll be looking from the Kenyan perspective, because that's what I'm aware. And I was wondering whether Fiona, you have analyzed this transition of changing land tenure, from group ranges to community land, and what does that present to the communities in form of land tenure, and some of the group ranges, because these have been provided for by the Community Land Act of 2016, giving the communities an opportunity whether to continue maintaining the group ranching form of tenure, like one title under a group of farmers, or subdivide the land, or move on to register it as a community land act, community land tenure, or alternatively, if they don't want to go that direction, subdivide the land into private ranches, of which this has presented also a very big challenge in terms of land tenure, because when the land is subdivided and ownership is individualized, and with the title deeds and open market for willing buyer, willing seller, we have seen that in the southern rangelands, a lot of pastoral lands have been lost, so to speak, through selling of land and through other unscrupulous means on the process of subdivision. And I don't know how much you have discovered or have looked into that, and how this change of tenure has either presented opportunities or challenges and difficulties to land security, and to some extent the food security, because land security and food security are really correlated. And that actually leads me to the findings of Rupsha and the team, because in the southern rangelands in Kenya, to be able to access formal funding, especially by the Agricultural Finance Corporation, which has been financing agricultural activities and pastoral, because they would give money to farmers to buy steers, young male cows, fatten them over season and take to the market. And it was a very good initiative, but could only be done through when you have title deed as a collateral. And that basically then was like an incentive forcing the group ranch farmers to subdivide land so that they could get the collateral to get the loans. Then the flip side of it is when calamity strikes, like as it often does, like droughts and all that, or livestock diseases.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I think we've lost Daniel. Yeah, I think
Do you hear
we
me?
lost it. Yeah, we lost you. We lost you for a second, Daniel. You're making
Yes,
some good comments, but just
right.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So what has happened in the past, and it's still happening, is that the Agricultural Finance Corporation comes in again and auction the land if farmers cannot be able to service their loans. So it has worked both ways, but I think it has worked more negatively, because in the past, a lot of farmers have lost their land because they couldn't manage the security, the insecurity that comes with livestock farming and financing and all that. So I don't know whether Rupsha, you are able to look into that specific issue of agricultural financing that has been happening in southern rangelands of Kenya, and perhaps it may be going to happen in the northern if they continue going that direction. That is number one. Number two is the challenge, maybe to both, is the challenge of mega development projects. These pastoral areas being now frontier areas for development, we have seen a lot of mega development projects happening in those areas. What challenges would they present in form of land tenure and land security and food security for that matter, including from large scale privatized conservation models like what's happening in northern Kenya. We have seen conservancies coming up, that they are so-called community conservancies, but not really community per se, because they're being managed by big private entities, and have had a challenge on grazing areas, pushing the livestock out of their core conservation areas. So what has, and that's just one example, but there are so many other development projects that are making inroads into these pastoral areas. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. This brings to mind, Daniel is our SPARC postdoc and doing some deep field research in Kenya. And I'm gonna suggest, Daniel, that in the not too distant future, you offer a webinar, because I think you've got some really interesting case study analyses of what's taking place in Kenya, which would be of interest to many people here. Rupsha, Fiona, would you like to respond at all to any of the points, mostly sort of shedding some light on what's taking place in Kenya from Daniel? Any responses or any supplemental points you'd like to raise? Just mindful of time, but if you do have any quick responses, great.
Very quickly, and yeah, nice to see you here, Daniel. We actually had a brief meeting last week, so yeah, so we kind of already discussed that, but yeah, but of course, always looking forward to more discussions. So yeah, so Daniel, for the purposes of this study, we actually just concentrated on the northern rangelands, but yeah, your point is very well taken that we also need to investigate some of these institutions who have been involved in financing and the needs. Like, I think it goes back to my point when I was doing the presentation, is that we have to come up with a little bit of innovative methods to actually to score, or even to understand, or to get the viability of people who are actually asking for loans or asking for finance, and not just base it on the standardized models of collateral or having like land as security and all that kind of thing. And this is definitely an area for the research and further investigation. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Rupsha. Fiona, any final thoughts from you?
No, they were all
No.
good points, but nothing to add.
Great. Okay, great. Well, listen, thanks very much, Rupsha and Fiona. Two great presentations, and thanks everybody for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend. I don't think there's any downside to having these kinds of webinars to share information. And just, I do appreciate, in response to a point you were raising, Fiona, about what next. I really do appreciate the thinking that goes into the results of the work that you're doing, and then your ideas about what next. I mean, this is really fundamental and pivotal for us in terms of planning the next round of research. And so, as you know, we're already picking up on a few threads of those, which we'll be talking about in more detail over the coming weeks, but that is really critical. You've outlined a number of research gaps. I'm not going to try and catch those, but I have been taking notes furiously here, and we have them in your presentation, but a number of gaps, both of you, areas for, questions that you were left with, clear gaps in the research that are sometimes regional. Some countries there's a lot of information, other countries there's very little, but these are opportunities for us to help fill those gaps going forward. And I think also one point about case studies, the challenge with scoping papers across 15 countries is that you get a broad overview, broad insight, which is valuable and important. But also the value of getting in depth in specific regions within countries, I think, can really shed some important light on what's taking place. And that kind of nuance is something that we'll be wanting to do a bit more of, I think, getting into depth in some case studies in some of the countries, some of the SPARC countries. But thank you. That was great. We will send out a notice about, I can't remember the schedule. I'm not going to name names right now, but I know a couple of other people have volunteered to do webinars. And I see that Taylor has been actively volunteering people that they'll be lined up for webinars, which I hope they'll be willing to do in the coming months. Stay tuned, and we will send out additional invites, and I look forward to that. So great to see you, all of you, and thank you again for participating. And a big thanks to Fiona and Rupsha for two great presentations. All from me.
Thanks all for the great questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Rupsha and Fiona.
Bye.
Just a note, please do reach out to Rajeshri and I if you'd like to present at the next webinar. We'll, just reach out to us and we'd be happy to have you. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.